One aircraft, roughly 9 hours in the air. And when that flight track is plotted on a chart, the arc it draws covers more of the Iranian coastline than a 6-ship destroyer picket line could physically monitor in the same window of time. That is not a theory. That is the geometry of the P-8 Poseidon, and in June of 2026, it is the geometry on which United States Central Command is betting the entire maritime surveillance architecture of the Gulf of Oman. The question worth asking, and the one that does not have a clean answer, is what happens during the hours when that aircraft is on the ground. Here is where this story is going. The US Navy has spent decades building one of the most capable maritime patrol fleets ever assembled. The P-8 Poseidon is the centerpiece of that fleet, a modified Boeing 737 stuffed with acoustic sensors, surface search radar, electro-optical cameras, and the processing power to fuse all of it into a single tactical picture in real time. It is extraordinarily effective. It is also finite. There are only so many airframes, only so many crews, only so many hours before a jet has to land, be refueled, be inspected, and put back in the air. And the Iranian coast does not take a break while that happens. To understand what the P-8 is actually doing over the Gulf of Oman, you have to start with the geography that makes this stretch of water so consequential. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow funnel at the eastern end of the Persian Gulf, is roughly 21 nautical miles wide at its tightest point. Through that gap, on a normal day in early 2026, flows somewhere between 16 and 17 million barrels of crude oil. That is close to 17% of total global oil consumption. Moving through a channel you could drive across in a fast motorboat in under an hour. The Gulf of Oman is the antechamber to that choke point. It is where tankers slow, where they form loose convoys, where they are most exposed before they thread the strait. It is also where the Iranian coastline runs for roughly 500 kilometers from the mouth of the strait all the way east toward Pakistan, offering dozens of coves, inlets, and shallow water launch points for the kind of fast attack craft and anti-ship missile batteries that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has been quietly accumulating for the better part of 3 decades. Controlling what happens in that antechamber is the mission, and that mission has traditionally been assigned to surface ships. A destroyer, say, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer like the USS Carney, which has operated in CENTCOM waters repeatedly, sits on a choke point by being physically there. Its radar horizon from mast level is roughly 20 to 25 nautical miles. Its sensors are excellent within that bubble, but it cannot be somewhere else at the same time. If the USS Carney is watching the western approach to the strait, it is not watching the eastern approach, and it is not watching the cluster of shallow water anchorages along the Makran coast, where ERG fast boats have been observed staging. To cover the full threat envelope, you need more hulls, and more hulls means more money, more crew, more maintenance, and more political decisions about where the US Navy is prepared to commit surface assets on a semi-permanent basis. The P-8 Poseidon solves part of that equation in a way no surface ship can match. A standard P-8 combat patrol sortie over the Gulf of Oman runs somewhere between 8 and 10 hours. During that window, the aircraft covers an area that operational planners measure in tens of thousands of square miles, a figure that varies depending on the mission, profile, altitude, and sensor configuration, but that consistently dwarfs what a single surface hull can screen. The radar system the P-8 carries, the ANAPI-10 multi-mode surface search radar, can detect and track surface contacts at ranges far beyond the visual horizon in all weather, day and night. The acoustic suite, built around sonobuoys the aircraft drops into the water, can monitor submarine traffic across swaths of the approach corridor simultaneously. The electro-optical and infrared sensors mounted in the aircraft's belly can identify individual hull types at distances a ship's mast-mounted camera could not approach. All of that data, radar tracks, acoustic signatures, optical imagery, feeds into a single fused tactical picture transmitted in near real time to USS Carney on the surface, to the carrier strike group if one is in theater, to CENTCOM headquarters in Qatar, and to the broader intelligence architecture that ultimately lands on a screen somewhere in the Pentagon where Pete Hegseth's staff is watching. The P-8 is not just an observer. It is a node in a network that multiplies the effective reach of every other asset in the region. What's most surprising about this setup isn't the capability, it's the cost arithmetic, and the cost arithmetic is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable. A single P-8 Poseidon sortie over the Gulf of Oman costs somewhere in the range of $300,000 to $400,000 when you factor in fuel, aircrew hours, sensor expendables like sonobuoys, and the proportional maintenance load on a jet that costs roughly $290 million per airframe to procure. That sounds like a large number until you put it next to the alternative. keeping an Ali Burt-class destroyer on station in the Gulf of Oman, accounting for fuel, crew, maintenance, and operational wear on a hull that costs roughly $2 billion to build, runs to a day rate that defense analysts have estimated at somewhere between $1 and $2 million per day, depending on operational tempo. Put yourself in the position of a CENTCOM planner, trying to justify that comparison to a budget committee in Washington, already under pressure from Donald Trump's White House to reduce overseas operational costs. One P-8 Sortie buys you 8 to 10 hours of coverage over an area that would require at minimum 3 or 4 destroyers to replicate with surface sensors, and those destroyers would still have gaps. The math points in one direction, and the US Navy has been following that math for a decade. The P-8 fleet that replaced the older P-3 Orion is now the primary fixed-wing maritime patrol asset for the United States Navy worldwide. CENTCOM relies on rotations through Diego Garcia and Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to maintain a continuous or near-continuous presence over the key approach corridors. When tensions with Iran spike, as they did in the spring and early summer of 2026, following a series of confrontations between URGC fast boats and commercial tankers in the Gulf of Oman, the sortie rate goes up, additional crews are deployed forward, and the coverage arc gets tighter. But here is the obstacle the planning documents do not advertise. A P-8 is a single-point asset. When it lands, its coverage area disappears. The gap between the end of one sortie and the beginning of the next, even with optimized crew rotation and positioned aircraft, is measured in hours, not minutes. During the spring 2026 escalation, maintenance requirements on 2 of the aircraft operating out of Diego Garcia forced a scheduling gap of roughly 6 hours on a rotation that was supposed to be continuous. 6 hours is not an abstract vulnerability. 6 hours is enough time for an URGC fast boat swarm to transit from a coast staging point to a position that threatens a tanker corridor, and to do it without being observed by any US sensor that can pass a real-time track to a surface combatant. The maintenance team worked through the night to compress that gap. The surveillance window still opened. The lesson, and this is the one CENTCOM planners have been wrestling with since the P-8 became the primary tool, is that coverage continuity is not the same as coverage capability. The P-8 is more capable than any surface ship at the surveillance mission. It is also, by definition, not always there. To understand how the Iranians have thought about that gap, you have to look at the layered architecture they have built along the coastline the P-8 is watching. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy does not have a blue water fleet. It has never tried to build one, and under Ali Khamenei's strategic framework, the doctrine of asymmetric resistance, it has explicitly rejected the idea that matching the US Navy hull for hull is either possible or necessary. What the Czech Navy has instead is a swarm and saturate concept built around 3 overlapping layers. The first layer is fast boats, fiberglass-hulled, low-radar cross-section craft that move in groups and are designed to approach a target from multiple vectors simultaneously, making them difficult to engage for a surface ship whose defenses are optimized for incoming missiles rather than incoming speedboats. The URGC fastboat inventory is large. Estimates run into the hundreds of active hulls, and the boats themselves are cheap, enough to be expendable. The second layer is anti-ship missiles, the Nor, which is a Chinese C-802 derivative, the Carter, and the longer-range Khalij-Fars ballistic anti-ship missile, designed to strike moving surface targets at ranges that keep the launcher well inside Iranian territorial waters. These are not precision instruments of the kind the US Navy deploys, but they do not have to be precision instruments when the target is a slow-moving oil tanker. The third layer, and this is the one that complicates the P-8's mission most directly, is the coastal defense radar and early warning network the URGC has installed along the Makran coast and the approaches to Hormuz. That network does not need to shoot down a P-8. It needs only to detect when a P-8 is overhead and communicate that window, and more importantly, the gaps between windows to the fastboat and missile units waiting on the coast. Masoud Pezeshkian's government in Tehran has publicly maintained that Iranian coastal defense activities are a sovereign right. Esmail Kakani, the commander of the URGC Quds Force, who coordinates broader strategic operations across the region, has been more direct in private channels monitored by US intelligence. The message, according to reporting available as of June 2026, is that Iran does not need to defeat the P-8. It needs to understand the P-8 schedule. That is a fundamentally different kind of threat than the one the surveillance architecture was designed to counter. And it is the threat that gives the cost asymmetry its real strategic weight. Detecting the P-8 surveillance gaps does not require a billion-dollar radar system. It requires observers, radios, and pattern recognition. capabilities that cost almost nothing compared to what the use is spending to maintain the surveillance coverage. Here is the central question in its sharpest form. The US Navy can win the sensor competition. The P-8 sees more, further, with more fidelity than anything the Garcia operates. But winning the sensor competition is not the same as winning the coverage competition. And winning the coverage competition with aircraft alone requires either more airframes than the US currently has forward deployed in theater, or shorter gap windows than the current maintenance and crew rest cycles allow. The wide eye is rented by the hour. When the hour is up, the eye closes. What this tells us about the current moment is worth sitting with. The P-8 program is the most capable maritime patrol asset in American history, and the US Navy has deployed it aggressively into the Gulf of Oman in response to real and documented Iranian provocations against commercial shipping. But the program was sized and structured for a threat environment that assumed surveillance gaps would be acceptable because adversaries would not be sophisticated enough to exploit them systematically. The Garcia in 2026 is sophisticated enough to exploit them systematically. That gap between assumption and reality is not a failure of the aircraft. It is a failure of the strategic concept the aircraft was embedded in. The costs that flow from that gap are real and measurable in a way that the budget debates in Washington do not always capture. When the 6-hour surveillance gap opened during the spring 2026 maintenance event at Diego Garcia, the USS Carney, operating as the surface picket at the eastern approach to Hormuz, went from having a fused picture of everything moving within a 0 nautical mile radius to having only its own mass-mounted radar coverage out to roughly 20 nautical miles. During that window, 3 EG fast boats conducted what appeared to be a probing run toward a Singaporean-flagged LNG tanker operating in the corridor. The boats turned away before reaching engagement range. The USS Carney tracked them on its own radar, issued radio challenges, and the incident resolved without a shot fired. What the USS Carney could not determine, and what the P-8, had it been overhead, might have been able to determine, was whether the probing run was opportunistic or deliberate, whether the Garcia unit turned away because the challenge worked, or because it had already achieved its actual objective, confirming that the surveillance gap existed, timing its duration, and reporting that information back to a planning cell that would use it to schedule the next, more serious operation. That is the kind of intelligence the US Navy does not have a clean answer to, and it is the kind of intelligence gap that costs money to close. Money that the current budget environment, under Donald Trump's broader push to reduce forward-deployed operational costs, is not obviously prepared to provide. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback: the decision to lean on P-8 patrols as the primary surveillance instrument in the Gulf of Oman, rather than investing in a supplementary layer of persistent unmanned systems that could fill the gap windows, is not primarily a military decision. It is a political one. The US Navy has proposed variants of an expanded MQ-9 Reaper maritime patrol capability. The MQ-9B Sea Guardian variant is already operating in some CENTCOM surveillance roles that could maintain presence during the hours a P-8 is on the ground. The cost delta between running a Sea Guardian orbit and running a manned P-8 sortie is substantial. An MQ-9 Reaper operating costs roughly $4,000 to $5,000 per flight hour against the P-8's substantially higher per hour figure. But integrating unmanned persistent surveillance into the existing manned patrol architecture requires investment in ground control infrastructure, communications links, and command and control procedures that the current budget cycle has not prioritized. Choosing to accept the gap is, in practical terms, choosing to accept the risk that comes with it, and that risk is not distributed evenly. It falls disproportionately on the commercial shipping operators, the tanker crews, the LNG carriers, the bulk carriers, who transit the Gulf of Oman during the windows when the P-8 is on the ground and the coverage arc is dark. We went through the incident reports from the first half of 2026, and one detail kept recurring in the formal after-action summaries filed by CENTCOM: maritime. In each of the 3 most significant Garcia fast boat probing incidents during the period, the timing of the approach correlated with a known or inferable patrol gap, either a sortie transition window or a period of reduced coverage linked to weather diversion. Whether that correlation is coincidence or pattern recognition on the Garcia's part is the question US intelligence has not been able to answer definitively. But the correlation exists, and it exists 3 times in 6 months. At some point, coincidence becomes a hypothesis worth discarding. The human dimension of this architecture is easy to overlook when the conversation is dominated by sensor ranges and sortie costs, but it is not actually separable from those numbers. The P-8 crews operating out of Diego Garcia and Al Udeid are typically 12-person mission teams. 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and a crew of tactical operators managing the sensor suites and communications links. A 9-hour sortie over the Gulf of Oman is not 9 hours of passive observation. It is 9 hours of active tasking, tracking dozens of surface contacts simultaneously, classifying them by hull type and behavior pattern, coordinating with surface units, responding to priority taskings from CENTCOM when a contact of interest appears on the radar picture, and managing the acoustic processing from sonobuoys that are expended at a rate that adds up across a deployment cycle. The cognitive load is substantial, and the crew rest requirements that follow a full-duration sortie are not negotiable under US Navy flight medicine. Rules: expanding coverage, running more sorties, shortening the gap windows is not simply a matter of adding fuel. It requires adding crews, which requires the pipeline of trained P-8 operators that the Navy has been building since the aircraft entered service in 2013, but that still does not produce qualified mission commanders on a timeline that matches the operational demand signal coming out of CENTCOM in 2026. Pete Hegseth, as Secretary of Defense, has publicly framed the Gulf of Oman presence as a demonstration of resolve, the US commitment to freedom of navigation, the credibility of deterrence against Iranian interference with commercial shipping. What that framing does not capture is the gap between the political statement and the operational reality. Resolve is declared, coverage is scheduled, and the schedule has holes in it that the Iranians, under Ali Khamenei's strategic direction, have had a decade to study, and that Ismail Carney's planning apparatus has had every incentive to map. On the commercial side, the consequences of those gaps are measurable in a way that moves markets. War risk insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Gulf of Oman have tracked almost perfectly with the publicly reported sortie tempo of US maritime patrol aircraft in the region. When the P-8 presence is dense, multiple aircraft available, high sortie rate, minimal gap windows, underwriters accept lower premiums because the probability of an undetected approach is reduced. When the sortie rate drops, or when a maintenance event creates a documented gap, the insurance market responds within days. In the first quarter of 2026, war risk premiums on Gulf of Oman transit reached levels that Lloyd's of London analysts described as the highest since the late stages of the Iran-Iraq war tanker crisis of the 1980s. The cost is ultimately passed to consumers in the form of higher shipping rates, which flow through to the end price of commodities that move in those tankers, and to the economies primarily in South and East Asia that depend on Gulf crude for the bulk of their energy import requirements. One detail that has stayed with me from the operational picture: in March 2026, a Greek-flagged chemical tanker transiting the eastern Gulf of Oman during what would later be confirmed as a P-8 sortie gap filed an incident report describing 4 URG fast boats that approached within 800 meters before breaking off. The tanker's captain radioed a mayday. The USS Carney was 140 nautical miles to the west. Response time at the destroyer's best speed would have been approximately 4 hours. The fast boats left before the destroyer could have arrived under any scenario. The incident lasted 11 minutes. What protected the tanker was not the US Navy's surveillance architecture. It was, apparently, the decision of the URG unit's commander to break off. Why that decision was made is not something US intelligence has been able to confirm. The balance of forces question: how many P-8s does it take to close the gap? And how many destroyers would it take to replicate that coverage with surface assets? Has a clean numerical answer that the US Navy's own studies have produced and that defense analysts outside the service have verified independently. To maintain continuous sensor coverage over the full Gulf of Oman approach corridor, from the eastern entrance of the Strait to the edge of the Makran coast, with no gap windows longer than 30 minutes, requires either 4 to 5 P-8 Poseidons operating on overlapping rotation schedules, each with its full crew complement, full maintenance support, and adequate spare parts inventory forward positioned, or a surface picket line of between 8 and 12 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, distributed across the corridor. The P-8 option costs on an annualized basis, including aircraft procurement amortization, crew, basing, and consumables, approximately 1/3 of what the surface picket option costs. It also produces a surveillance product that is qualitatively superior to the surface option in terms of area covered, sensor fidelity, and the ability to fuse acoustic, radar, and optical data into a single coherent picture. The argument for the aircraft option, on the numbers, is nearly airtight. The argument against it is the gap. The surface ship does not land. The Arleigh Burke does not have a crew rest cycle that takes it off station for 8 hours. The destroyer sitting in the Strait is there continuously. its radar sweeping its 25-mile bubble until it runs out of fuel or is ordered elsewhere. It cannot be moved without creating a gap, but it also cannot be deceived by pattern recognition into revealing a schedule, because it has no schedule to reveal. It is simply there. Something about that trade-off doesn't sit right when you look at the actual incident record. From 2026. The P-8 is better in almost every measurable dimension, and yet the incidents that have come closest to escalation, the moments that have moved insurance markets and prompted CENTCOM situation reports that landed on the desks of Donald Trump and Ali Khamenei simultaneously, have happened during the windows when the P-8 was not overhead. This was not supposed to be a problem the US Navy had to solve in 2026. The MQ-9B Sea Guardian was supposed to be filling the gap windows by now. The persistent unmanned maritime patrol capability that would allow the P-8 to rotate off-station without opening a surveillance hole was in the acquisition pipeline, funded at a modest level, scheduled for expanded deployment in the 2025-2026 timeframe. The program slipped. Acquisition delays, integration challenges with the existing CENTCOM communications infrastructure, and a budget environment that deprioritized unmanned maritime patrol in favor of higher profile procurement pushed the Sea Guardian fielding timeline. Back the gap windows opened, the incidents followed. On paper, the P-8 plus destroyer combination was airtight. In practice, the piece that was supposed to connect them, the persistent unmanned layer, collapsed under the weight of bureaucratic and budgetary friction before it could be fielded at scale. The surveillance architecture as it exists in June 2026 is, in a precise technical sense, the one that was designed. It is also missing the component that would have made it work without gaps. The Bavar 373 air defense system that Iran has deployed along the coast, Tehran's claimed equivalent of the Russian S-300, with range figures that Iranian state media has placed at 200 kilometers, adds a further dimension to this picture. Whether the Bavar 373 actually performs at the specifications Tehran claims is a matter of genuine uncertainty among Western defense analysts. The system has not been tested against a real adversary, but its existence constrains the altitudes and approach corridors available to the P-8, which in turn affects the effective range of some of the aircraft's sensors, particularly the electro-optical suite, which performs better at lower altitudes. The P-8 crew that has to route around a potential Bavar 373 engagement envelope is a crew that is not covering the area it would otherwise cover. The Iranian air defense network does not need to shoot down a P-8. It needs only to change where the P-8 can safely go. Will this surveillance architecture hold if the IRGC decides to move from probing operations to something more serious? If Ali Khamenei, in consultation with Mojtaba Khamenei and whatever constellation of advisors shapes the supreme leader's strategic decisions, concludes that the gap windows represent an opportunity worth taking. Comment yes if you think the current P-8 presence is sufficient to deter a real escalation, or no if you think the gaps are too significant. We read everyone. The arithmetic of the Gulf of Oman in June 2026 comes down to a single uncomfortable equation. The United States has the most capable maritime patrol aircraft ever built, operating in one of the most strategically consequential waterways in the world, for a fraction of what surface-based coverage would cost. And that aircraft, every 8 to 10 hours, has to land. Every fleet planner, every CENTCOM watch officer, every tanker captain filing an insurance declaration for a Gulf of Oman transit has to decide which side of that equation they are living on. The side where the P-8 is overhead, the picture is fused, and the Archie fast boats are visible from the moment they leave the beach. Or the side where the airfield lights are on at Diego Garcia, the maintenance crew is working through the pre-flight checklist, and the corridor is watched only by a destroyer's radar horizon. 25 miles of coverage in a theater that is hundreds of miles wide. Donald Trump has called the American presence in the Gulf of Oman a demonstration of strength that Iran cannot ignore. Ali Khamenei has called it a provocation that demonstrates American overextension. Both of those assessments can be simultaneously true, and that is the uncomfortable place this story ends. A fleet can cover the Gulf with a few flying sensors, cheap, capable, finite, or with many tied down ships, expensive, persistent, narrow. The flying sensors have gaps, the ships have budgets. And somewhere in the space between those two constraints, the next incident is already being planned. Where would you put the bet? A tight rotation of P-8s that stretches coverage thin but keeps costs manageable, or a hull on every lane? Burning fuel money the Navy says it doesn't have. Tell us in the comments before we show you what the real mix looks like in part 2. If the gap question interests you, the next video goes inside the specific engagement geometry of the Strait of Hormuz itself, what it actually takes to close it, and what the US Navy's plan looks like if it has to reopen it by force.